So what are emotions? They're specific reactions to events that arise before we're conscious of experiencing them. So they're subconscious responses. And emotions actually have three different elements to them. So they comprise subjective feelings, physiological responses, and expressive behaviours. So it's kind of immediate feelings that you get. Your body responds in a certain way. Perhaps your heart rate speeds up, or you feel yourself flushing. There can be any number of physiological responses. Your blood pressure can change, can go up or down. That then acts through expressive behaviours. That's how they are expressed. So, for instance, if you get a shock, if someone comes up behind you and pokes you and you're not expecting it, then you will jump. Your heart will have a little missed beat. You may go pale if you're feeling really quite frightened, because all of your blood is actually moving inwards to protect the internal organs. So that's the three elements of emotions, and they occur in the subcortical regions of the brain, in the amygdala and ventromedial prefrontal cortices particularly. So they set off biochemical reactions that alter your physical state. What's very important to remember about emotions is that it's the emotions that create the physical changes, that set off rushes of hormones, that change how you feel, that change your bodily responses, not the other way round. We tend to think it's a rush of hormones that causes the emotion. It's not at all. So they control the hormones. So fear stimulates adrenaline, cortisol, norepinephrine. Happiness would stimulate, and pleasure would stimulate serotonin and dopamine. And they can be measured. So this is where the science comes in the research that's been done into emotions, as well as seeing which areas of the brain light up under an MRI scan when people are actually being put through tests so that they feel specific emotions. So there's your brain activity, which is measured by EEG or a functional MRI scanner. Blood flow, which affects your blood pressure. So if you're feeling shocked, your blood pressure will drop. If you're feeling angry or excited, then your blood pressure will rise. There's a rush of blood to the face if you're feeling angry or excited or embarrassed. A draining of blood from your face if you're feeling shocked or frightened. So your colour heightens with anger and it pales with shock and fear. So it affects your heart rate and your pupil dilation. Also sweating. If you're in a state of stress through any particular emotion, then your hands will sweat for a start. You'll notice it in your hands. And they can be measured very, very clearly. So they can also be seen and interpreted. When you look at somebody, you can gauge what emotions they're feeling by their facial expressions, by micro expressions, which I'll talk about a little in a minute, and their body language. So this is the area, the subcortical region is the area that deals with emotions. And I'll be talking about that and the difference with the cortical region in a minute too. So it's specifically around this area, the amygdala area, the hypothalamus. The orbital and medial prefrontal cortex has a slightly different role that I'll mention a bit later on. But this is the whole area that deals with your emotions, and this particularly around here. Temperament and the prefrontal cortices. This has been a very interesting study to explore, because Richard Davison, who's professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, with his team, they found that if someone was feeling joy, enthusiasm, interest, or altruism, the things that you would see as being positive emotions, there would be distinct increased activity in the left prefrontal cortex. So that would light up. if someone was feeling depression or pessimism or anxiety, or what you would call a negative emotion, an uncomfortable emotion, then there was increased activity in the right prefrontal cortex, so that would light up. And what they found, that some subjects naturally had a more active left prefrontal cortex, and some had a more active right prefrontal cortex. And those who were more active on the left generally had a more positive attitude towards life. They were more optimistic and generally feel more positive emotions, whilst those with a more active right prefrontal cortex tended to have a pessimistic attitude towards life and generally feel more negative emotions like depression, anxiety. So this, they discovered, is set in place very, very early on. There was a large study with nearly 400 children aged 2.5 years that showed that, in fact, the brain carries the signatures, holds the signatures of extroversion and introversion at that very, very young age, that the children who had a more active left prefrontal cortex were far more confident, were more extrovert, more social with other children, less worried about being in unusual situations or unfamiliar situations, while the children who had more activity in the right prefrontal cortex naturally tended to be introverts and were more prone to taking things very badly, feeling depressed, being hypersensitive, and not coping as well in unusual situations. So this is something that actually is set in place very, very early on in life. And we can look at this from a perspective of dogs as well, because the kind of influences in their brains is very similar to the influences in ours. I made a little note here that I just thought you may find interesting. It's not so much about emotions, but the prefrontal cortex is also known as the watcher. It's the area of the brain that monitors consciousness. And this isn't just consciousness in the sense of, am I fully awake and aware, or am I asleep, or am I out cold? It's also consciousness from a perspective of people who go into heightened states of consciousness, and people who, there's been a lot of studies done with people a lot that have been very interesting to see that there's distinct changes in the brain, but that area is actually the watcher. So what do we classify as visible emotions? The main ones that you can see in the face are fear, anger, happiness, disgust, contempt, sadness, and surprise. There are other emotions as well that we can recognize. If someone gives us a loving look, or our dog gives us a look of love from across the room, then we recognize that as well. But from a scientific perspective, where there are actual research results, these are the emotions that are considered to be the main visible emotions. And there's my beautiful soft-eyed Lucy greyhound in the background photo with her huge deer-like eyes that she was constantly giving the look of love. Now, there's primary emotions and secondary emotions. So primary emotions are an immediate response to a situation or an event. So the moment we experience an event, we create a perception of that event. And it's that perception that gives rise to an immediate emotional reaction. So primary emotions give us information about our perception of the moment, and they're the ones that compel us to act, that make us act. For instance, fear is the emotion that we would feel instantly if we were faced with a threat. Happiness if we receive good news. Secondary emotions follow on from primary emotions, and they show us how we're mentally processing the experience and the emotions. So if you were afraid, if somebody came up behind you and made you jump, then you might feel angry afterwards, or you might laugh, depending on how you cope with situations where you were taken by surprise. So emotional states such as shame and depression, relief and dismay are secondary emotions. So you might first of all feel shock in a situation, and then shame or embarrassment if you were doing something you shouldn't have been doing and you were caught out. And we tend to often confuse a secondary emotion through primary emotion. So ongoing anxiety may be due to a primary emotion of fear. This is because very often the primary emotion is only felt momentarily, and then the secondary emotion takes over, the kind of coping mechanism, if you like, takes over from that. And that tends to be what we get to see because we may only have a flash of the primary emotion. So secondary emotions hang around for longer. High voltage or slow burn, we've got different ways of experiencing and expressing our emotions. And we know that humans and animals experience a very wide range of emotions. We don't know whether animals experience emotional states in the same way as we do, but it indicates it's highly likely, particularly with the research that Gregory Byrne and his team, and several other teams now too, have done, putting fully awake dogs into functional MRI scanners who have been trained to go in the scanner and are in a very relaxed state. And the same areas of the brain light up, particularly the subcaudate, when they're presented with something that's familiar or a picture of the person who they live with. So there's a lot of evidence that animals feel emotions in the same way as we do. We have an emotional profile that determines whether we experience rapid onset high voltage emotions or a gradual onset slow burn. So think about how you experience your emotions. Is it a very sudden thing? Do you find that you kind of go up in flames at a moment's notice, that you feel very excited very easily, that you have wonderful bursts of happiness and joy? Or do you find that they kind of creep up on you and then you become aware that that's actually what you're feeling? Or even possibly that you may not be aware yourself of what you're feeling in that moment, and someone else may point it out to you who's noticed the changes in your face and your body language. And the more rapid the onset is, the harder it is to control the outward expression. So if you're a high voltage person, then it's very, very difficult to control the ability to stop other people from seeing what you're feeling. You can't hide your emotions at all. You're very transparent. If you're a slow burn, even if you're aware of what you're feeling, then you're more able to kind of take a step back within yourself and hide that emotion or make attempts to hide that emotion. Although, as I'll be saying in a few minutes, you can never truly hide your emotions if somebody knows what to look for. When an emotion's triggered, you get what's called a refractory period. Now, refractory means unmanageable, ungovernable. It's kind of not really under control. So the impulses that arise the moment an emotion is triggered are translated into thoughts, actions, and vocalizing. And during this moment, this refractory period, we're unable to monitor or step back from our reaction. So we're completely immersed in the emotion in that moment, even if it's only a brief moment. So during the refractory period, the only information we can take in is the information that supports the emotion that we're experiencing. So for instance, my daughter has this habit of occasionally wearing false eyelashes, and sometimes she'll leave them by the bathroom sink, and I'll kind of wander into the bathroom in the middle of the night or very early in the morning and think I've seen a spider, and it'll make me jump because it's quite a large spider. So I have that kind of oh moment, and then I'll realise actually when I look closer it's not at all, it's a false eyelash, not a spider. So nothing to be worried about. And so that is that refractory period where you make a sort of judgment that is just based on that particular moment, and there's no control over the emotion that you feel. And then generally that goes into a secondary emotion where it's kind of slower, very recognizable, easier to kind of keep in check, if you like. The emotions are signals. So emotions have a signal, each of them do, but they also act as signals to us and to others. they display our inner feelings publicly. The point to make is that emotional signals don't reveal our thoughts or the cause of the emotion itself, but by reading the signals accurately, we can determine how others are feeling. Thought follows emotion, so the emotional signal can offer clues to the thought. However, it can be very easy to interpret that wrongly, because if someone is showing fear, that could be the result of a number of different causes. So it could be, if a dog's showing fear, it could be that it's been startled, it's heard a strange noise, that somebody is wearing an article of clothing that the dog isn't used to, or that they've heard a sound from a long, long way away that you're not able to hear, or picked up a scent that's disturbed them. There could be lots of different reasons for that display of fear, but what we tend to do is make instant judgments. We'll notice that emotion and we'll put it on whatever we consider it could possibly be in that moment. So we can't actually read thoughts through emotions, but we can get a good idea if we look deeply into it of what is going on in the mind and explore further, find out where that emotion's coming from, what the reason for it is, and what it's leading into, what other emotions follow through after it. Facial expressions for anger, fear, disgust, happiness, surprise, and sadness conveyed in under a quarter of a second. They're snapshot signals, and I'll be talking a little about micro expressions in a minute too. Embarrassment, guilt, and shame are sequential. They're secondary emotions. They follow displays of other emotions. So for you to feel embarrassed, something has to happen first of all. You have to feel something first, or to feel guilt or shame. You have a feeling of maybe shock or anger, or, you know, could be anything really. But that other emotion, the secondary emotion, then follows through from there. So this is where we got stuck in the recording last time. So hopefully you'll be able to see the slide after this, but have a little look at it and think, what is this woman experiencing? What emotion or emotions is she experiencing? Those of you who came to my last talk, because this slide was in there, will know, because I gave the answer. But just take a moment and have a think. She's actually experiencing shock and fear. And the way you can see this, with surprise, you get the rounded mouth, but she's also got very rounded eyes. She's showing a lot of the sclera, the whites of the eyes. Her upper eyelid is very, very raised. Her lower eyelid is compressed, and the eyebrows are actually slightly raised, and that's raising the forehead so that you can see the lines across the forehead too. So shock and fear in that image. Oops, I think I've missed one. There we go. Emotion is energy in motion, and it's derived, the word's derived from the Latin emovere, meaning to move, which it's defined as any feeling that moves the mind towards thought. So you get the emotion and then you get the thought. Mathieu Ricard, who is a Frenchman who gained his PhD and then became a Tibetan monk, and has written an awful lot about emotions. He's been the subject for many, many, many functional MRI scans by Paul Ekman and other scientists, and has been involved in scientific studies with Paul Ekman, a group of other scientists, and the Dalai Lama into the emotions and the mind. And Mathieu Ricard says emotion conditions the mind towards adopting a certain perspective. So what he means there is that habitual emotional states, for instance, pessimism, have a profound effect on our mental states and well-being. And if we constantly move ourselves into positive states emotionally, if we focus on what's good in our lives rather than what's negative, then that habitually moves us into having that perspective generally rather than just occasionally. So it becomes a habit, basically. Emotions shift very quickly, they're not static. And when we work with emotional issues, we're aiming to change the emotion and the behavioural response to the emotional surge. Once we achieve this, the dog learns to cope better with the emotional state so that you don't get the intense surges. The dog learns an element of self-control. Now, feelings. People tend to confuse emotions and feelings and think they're the same thing. And in fact, they're very, very different. Emotions arise in the subcortex. Feelings originate in the neocortical region. They're mental associations and reactions to the emotion. So you have the emotion first, and then you have the feeling. And they're subjective. Feelings are influenced by our own personal beliefs, any experiences that we've had that create memories that then have an effect on the way that we feel and think. And they're a mental portrayal or a projection of what's happening in your body when you experience an emotion. So they're mental byproducts that arise from your brain, perceiving, recognizing, and giving meaning to an emotion. So the feelings happen directly in your brain, and it arises after an emotion. They involve cognitive input, thoughts, and they can't be precisely measured like emotions can be. So they don't necessarily have an impact on your blood pressure or heart rate, all pupil dilation, all of the things that emotions definitely have an impact on. So this is the area to do with our emotions, particularly around here, and the neocortex here, higher order thinking. This is where feelings are. This is where you experience feelings. So what do we classify as feelings? There's Sky snoozing away in the background in that photo. Anxiety, boredom, jealousy, pain, discomfort, tiredness, dread, embarrassment, humiliation, grief relief, euphoria. Lots of other feelings as well. These are the main ones. And sensations such as sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell that come through the sensory portal. And the quick explanation, which makes it really simple for all of us, from Dr. Susan McKay, is emotions play out in the theatre of the body, feelings play out in the theatre of the mind. It's a very good way to remember. Now, moods, different again. So they've got no clear trigger sometimes. Occasionally they have. Something negative can happen which will put us in a negative mood. But very often there's no obvious reason. You may wake up in a really odd mood. You may wake up feeling happy or feeling uncomfortable and out of sorts or depressed. There's no obvious trigger very often. So moods reinforce emotions, but they can also change emotions. This is because the mood that we're in distorts our perceptions of every moment and of what's going on around us. So you'll recognize this through, if you're in a negative mood, then things that would normally make you laugh will really irritate you. You find it hard to see the humour in things when you're in a negative mood. You might be more grouchy, less tolerant of those around you. If you're in a very positive mood, then even if someone does something that normally would annoy you, you'll find it easier to laugh it off and not be bothered by it. So moods obscure our view of reality because they distort our perceptions, whether that's in a negative way or a positive way, depending on what the mood is. And because they distort our perceptions, they change our behaviour. So if we have a powerful emotional experience, then that will affect our mood or bring about a mood, and so we respond emotionally strongly to that mood. Paul Ekman and other scientists believe that moods are very likely generated by neurohormonal changes that aren't directly linked to an environmental event. But sleep deprivation, food deprivation, affects our moods and triggers particular moods as well. I mean, there's nothing worse than being absolutely exhausted or really, really hungry and not being able to meet those needs. So that's as true for dogs and any other animals as it is for us. Now, the the universality of emotions. Professor Paul Ekman and his team discovered that there's the same physical facial displays of these 7 emotions in every culture. And what he did was he went out and spent a lot of time with cultures that had no exposure to our modern world, and indigenous cultures, really way out from what we would term civilization. And he found that even there, the facial expressions for particular emotions were exactly the same as they are here. So the 7 main emotions that can be recognized are fear, anger, surprise, happiness, sadness, disgust, and contempt. Shame is another one that's very easy to recognize, but that tends to be more of a secondary emotion. As I was saying earlier, another emotion comes first before that one steps in. And that's Rosie in the background from the ISCP, and into dogs, I think, too, actually. When she very kindly let me video her and photograph her when I interviewed her for another webinar that I did on microexpressions. And I interviewed her and asked her some very awkward questions among some really kind of okay questions, and caught her expressions and interpreted them. And that one is very easy for all of us to recognize. You know, a happy face is something that we all recognize very easily. Now, interpretation of emotions. We interpret the visible expressions of emotions subconsciously, but we can learn how to interpret them consciously, to actually read people, to read animals. We do this all the time with dogs. We're aware of their body language and of their facial expressions. We do it very often unconsciously with people, but those of us working with dogs are very careful to do it consciously with dogs so that we can monitor how they're feeling, particularly if they're in a situation where they're stressed or could be nervous or afraid. Paul Ekman says that the face is a multi-signal, multi-message signal system, which it certainly is. And facial expressions can be fixed for half a second to 4 seconds. Now, microexpressions last less than a quarter of a second, and they reveal emotions that are repressed or suppressed. So with the emotions that are repressed that you see as micro expressions, these are emotions that the other person isn't aware that they're feeling. They're not trying to hide anything, but there'll be this flicker of a change of expression and they won't even be aware of it happening. But if you know what to look for, you can read that. When it's a suppressed emotion that you get a flicker of, that is an emotion that the person is aware of feeling and doesn't want you to recognize, doesn't want you to see it. In the tests that I've had to do with my course in that, they're very, very difficult. You get lots and lots of photos of a neutral face, and then there's a flash where that face changes, there's an expression on that face, and then a flashback to neutral, and you have a 30th of a second to actually determine what that emotion is. And a 30th of a second, I can tell you, is ever so fast. It's quite difficult to do, but really fascinating and very exciting when you get it right too. And body language backs up what we see in the face. So we tend to look at the face first, see what's going on there, and then check what's going on in the body. And the amazing face is Jim Carrey doing one of his funny faces. So we've got 43 facial muscles that contribute to displaying emotion, and we're capable of over 10,000 expressions, which is quite extraordinary when you think about it. nobody could tell me how many facial muscles there are in dogs, and I've asked vets and everything. I've poured through my anatomy and physiology books, and I ended up just having to count them, and I found over 30 facial muscles that definitely contribute to expression, but there could be more that I missed on there, but you know, they have a lot. I think probably they've got roughly as many as we have, but no one has actually counted them, which is very interesting. And these are the main facial muscles that are used in expressions, and you can kind of see when you look at that how they pull together to create those changes in the face. It's really quite fascinating. And in a dog as well. There's a lot of similarities in the expressions, facial expressions in humans and dogs. So Mark Bekoff has written a lot about animal emotions, both in his books and in his Psychology Today blog. And Paul Ekman has said that the facial expressions of emotion are similar in humans and animals, but they weren't the first to recognise this. Charles Darwin wrote about it in The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, his book that came out in 1872, which was 13 years after On the Origin of Species was published. And in there he said that he was very aware that animals, and particularly dogs, because he loved his dog, had particular expressions. He was convinced that they felt the same emotions as we did. The facial action coding system, FACS, is what is used scientifically when you're actually looking at facial expressions, and each area of the face has a number that different combinations of those numbers create various expressions. And with the FACS units, the action units, AU means action unit, work as well. So I won't go through all of these, but it's kind of interesting to look at that AU1, the inner brow raiser. Well, if you look at that image, this is what someone would do when they were worried or afraid. The eyebrows go up at the top. In the inner brow, they rise. When you're angry, the outer brow rises, or the brow lowers. This one as well, because you can see that just one brow has risen rather than both. People will do that when they don't actually believe what you're saying. The upper lid raiser, which can be surprise, shock, cheek raiser, which you get when you're smiling, and the lid tightener if you're feeling tense or angry. These three here, the nose wrinkler, upper lip raiser, and nasolabial deepener, you get all of those when someone expresses disgust. Lip corner puller and cheek puffer you get when someone's smiling, and the dimpler. If someone's angry, then you'll see the lips tighten and compress. It may stretch if you're afraid. So there's various elements to all of these that it makes it very, very interesting when you look at them. And then we have the visible expressions of the emotions. I thought I'd show you some pictures where you can see the same emotion in a human and in a dog. So with fear, we find it very easy to recognize fear in dogs because we work with them and we're being very careful to keep them feeling safe, and to keep those around them safe if they're likely to be very reactive. But you get, if you look at the face here, you've got the stretching and tightening of the lips and the jaw. The lips are stretched back. The eyes are wide, the upper eyelid is raised, but you've got this distinct pattern in the eyebrows where they go up in the center. So there's a great deal of tension in the face in this expression. And in this poor little dog, you can see the same thing going on. The eyes are really protruding. I know that cheetahs have big eyes anyway, but the eyes are kind of even rounder. You can see the sclera around there. The lips tightly closed, the mouth tightly closed there. The ears are pinned right back so that there's this tension that is pulling all of the muscles of the face back, as well as then you would look at the body and you'll see the paw lift, you'll see the way that the dog is hunched over, that the tail's between the legs, you know, all of the tension is evident in all of those areas. Anger. The face gets longer in anger. In this photo, the mouth is open, but the mouth can be closed, and in that case, the lips would be compressed. But you get this deep furrowing of the brows. The brows go right down and furrow. You get the line here. You get wrinkles at the top of the nose. There's a huge amount of tension that is pulling up the skin beneath the eyes, as well as the wide open mouth. And, you know, you can almost hear that man roaring. And in the dog, exactly the same. You can see exactly the same is going on in that face. Surprise. With surprise, you get quite a soft, round mouth. The mouth opens in an O shape. The eyes get bigger, but not very large like they do in fear, with lots of white around them, but they get wider. You can't see the eyebrows in this photo, but the eyebrows raise up and they're in a nice even arch, rather than coming in at the corners up or down as they would be in fear or anger. And with that dog, you kind of wonder what's happened with that dog, but it's a very similar looking expression. Sadness. The whole face kind of sinks downwards in sadness. So although he hasn't got a droopy mouth, you can see there the muscles have kind of slackened and moved down. The eyes are kind of slightly downwards. You've got the sad expression, and the eyebrows are raised slightly in the middle. It's a very kind of distinct expression, and with that dog as well. This was a dog who was very sick, and that very sad expression. You can see again the eyebrows are pulled in, drawn in towards the centre. You can see the ripple going on there, and this sort of very sad expression. Disgust. You don't see this as often in dogs as you do in people. But what happens, she's portraying a very, very obvious image of disgust in that you can see, you know, her kind of nose is wrinkled. She's got this wedge here around the top mouth, which is what you always see with disgust. You can see the lines very firmly that you get when the nose is wrinkled upwards, and you get the kind of little wrinkles around there too, and the frown line. But very often with disgust, you may only see the lip curl, where the top lip moves up slightly towards the nose, and you may only see that very, very briefly. With dogs, you don't see it as often with dogs, but I have seen dogs look disgusted, more so than this one. This was the closest picture that I could find to it, but you tend to get a wrinkle around the nose as well as the kind of slightly open mouth and that bleh expression. Contempt. Simon Cowell is the master of the art of the contempt expression, so I thought I'd use him for this photo. Contempt is the only expression, facial expression, where you only use one side of the face. It's the only unilateral face expression. With disgust, all of the action takes place down the center of the face. You've got the eyebrows drawn in, you've got the nose wrinkling, you've got the upper lip curling, and the lines by the side of the nose more prominent. With contempt, it just happens here. This is the only place. One corner of the mouth goes up, and it may only be a little flicker, but it's there if you look for it. with this dog, he looks pretty fed up with, you know, I don't know what they've done to him to catch him in that expression. But again, if you look, as well as that expression in his eyes, this area is slightly raised as well. It's very, very similar. I would say that dog was feeling contempt towards the person. Shame, I know the jury's out on this one. I did put this photo in though. The studies that Alexandra Horowitz has done, and Mark Beckhoff has written about them quite a lot as well. With the original studies that she did, she said dogs don't feel guilt and shame. They were responding to whatever emotion their person, their owner, was feeling, which is very likely. But she has also said since then, and Mark Beckhoff has written about this too, that it doesn't mean that they definitely don't feel those emotions. It's possible that they do, but scientific studies haven't actually taught us yet that they do. So until we've got the science, it's very difficult to know one way or the other. The kind of jury's out on it, really. But what you tend to get with shame is a downward look. The head drops, the eyes drop, the chin drops, and they look away sideways, if it's a human. With this pup, I would imagine this pup is showing appeasing signals because he or she has been told off. But I have seen, I mentioned it in my last talk, that when I was young, we had a Yorkshire Terrier. We had lots of dogs, but one of our dogs was a Yorkshire Terrier. And my father took her to the groomer. She had the usual lovely long Yorkie coat that we used to groom every day. And he took her to the groomers and had her hair cut very, very short. And she came home and my mum laughed when she saw her. And poor little Zoe scurried under the sofa and just refused to come out. And when eventually we got her out from under there, this was the expression she used. You know, she just seemed to be mortified, poor little love. She really didn't take it well that she'd been laughed at. She obviously realised that she was being laughed at rather than laughed with, because we used to play with her a lot and laughed with her a lot. And she loved that. But she recognised that distinction in the tone of laughter. And happiness, which is very easy to recognise, and it's kind of one expression that everybody can recognise. Sort of happiness, anger and sadness are the main ones that are very, very easy to see. So you can have a closed mouth or an open mouth, but you get the puffed up cheeks, you get the wrinkles under the eyes because the lower eyelid rises, the muscles in the face are relaxed. So it's very, very easy, and you can see in these two, in the dog and the pup, they're looking very happy. Now, emotion and behaviour. Emotion is a major factor that drives behaviour, but what we have to also consider is there could be other reasons for what's going on emotionally with a dog. It could be biochemical, there could be some sort of hormone imbalance going on, or neurological, there could be changes due to something like a brain injury or a tumour or epilepsy. It could be genetic predisposition to particular emotional states that lead to behaviours. So we know now that a fearful or an aggressive parent can pass this tendency on to their offspring. And we know that puppies born to a mother who is very relaxed, who's very well cared for, who's very well balanced emotionally, are much more likely to be like her, to carry those traits within them. Association, so it could be that the dog has an association with something that we may not realise what that association is, so we need to look for it. It could be due to certain stimuli, and whether or not we're aware of those. This morning, Sky, who does behave quite oddly sometimes nowadays because he's not very well, but this morning he went and I found him on the stairs. I could hear him shuffling about in the hallway, and I found him trying to squeeze himself, and he's a big dog, onto one of the stairs, and he was hunched up, his tail was right between his legs, And I thought, what on earth is going on? You know, what's happened? And I looked around, couldn't see anything. And then I just had this feeling. So I went out into the garden and looked up, and there was a big hot air balloon overhead, not far from the garden. And Sky's become quite phobic about hot air balloons lately. And so even though I couldn't see it or hear it, and he was inside the house, he wasn't out in the garden when it went over, he was aware of it, he could hear it, certainly. And so what I did was I closed the curtains in the hallway. He couldn't see anything when he looked out, in case it was visible for him, and just kind of got him comfortable and let him rest. And he was fine after a little while, and I could open the curtains again and he'd go out in the garden. But, you know, the point I'm making is that we don't always immediately know what the stimuli could be for an emotion that leads to a behaviour. With Sky, he was terrified, he was really scared. Tiredness and overstimulation affect the emotions and affect the behaviour. We know that children get overwrought when they're tired and overstimulated, and happy laughter can very, very quickly turn to tears. And it's the same with dogs. And health issues, physical issues, affect the emotions, pain especially, and particular health issues, hypothyroid for one, there can be unprecedented aggression in a dog that is never normally aggressive, which can point to that, and any number of other health issues too. So there's lots of different reasons behind it. So emotion doesn't just drive behaviour. We need to find out what the other causes are that are contributing factors. So with emotional states and behaviour, you have the triggers and the context, the environment, the associations, whether a particular memory has been sparked, what the history of the dog is, where they've come from, what they've experienced, as much information about the past as possible that can help you to understand why a dog experiences particular emotions, and the dog's health, physical, mental, and emotional. And also, what's very important, I feel, is responses from others, because the responses that come from us or from other dogs or any other creature in the environment can be a precursor to a behaviour. You need to look at how everybody is interacting in a certain situation in order to really get to the truth of the matter. So it's not necessarily the event that triggers the emotion, it's the appraisal and perception of the event. So is it a threat, or is it something that I want to be involved in? And that appraisal comes about at great speed. It's subconscious, there's no control over it. It just happens very, very fast. And we all know that a dog under stress is far more likely to perceive everything as negative or threatening. Very fearful dogs also, but if a dog is in a highly stressed state, then everything is going to be frightening. And it's important that we monitor our emotions too, because dogs are very highly sensitive to our emotional states. So if we become aware of a negative emotion or a feeling, then we can apply an antidote to neutralize it, is how I see it. So it's like an acid and an alkali. If you see a negative emotion as an acid, then you use an emotion that is an alkali to neutralize that, to make it at least more comfortable. So if you focus on the opposite emotion to the one you're feeling, if you're feeling an acid emotion, then that can really help. So if you're feeling angry, it can help to push yourself into compassion, to consider how that other people might feel, how the other person might feel, how the dog would feel, what could be behind the behaviour, be understanding rather than just angry. If you're feeling fearful, then you can take deep breaths to help yourself feel calmer. So we can basically use it as an incompatible behaviour in a very similar way to how we'll ask a dog to perform an incompatible behaviour. So we'll ask a dog to sit who's jumping up and down, because you can't jump and sit at the same time. So we can use this on our own emotions and monitor those, because we're affecting our dogs very strongly by how we're feeling at the time. And I'm sure everybody has experienced that, how well our dogs do respond. Now, trauma in the brain, there's a lot of evidence now from one particular paper has been written on it, but there's been others as well, that early abuse and neglect in humans and animals alters the brain function. So children who've been exposed to family violence showed the same patterns of brain activity as soldiers exposed to combat, PTSD basically. And exposure to pictures of angry faces resulted in increased activity in the anterior insula and the amygdala. And this was written about in heightened neural reactivity to threat in child victims of family violence. It's just as relevant for dogs as well. Trauma strongly colours emotional responses. And as we know, the amygdala and the anterior insula are in the subcortical region of the brain. So it's the emotions rather than the feelings. And there's been some very interesting social cognitive neuroscience studies. This is a relatively new science, but Dr. Matthew Lieberman and Dr. Naomi Eisenberger's paper was published in the Neuro Leadership Journal, and I've read it and it's very, very interesting. It describes experiments in social cognitive neuroscience. So what they found was they put the subjects, well, they put a subject at a time in a functional MRI scanner, and told them that they were going to be playing a game with other subjects, when in fact they weren't. The game was actually with a computer, not another human being. And the scientists set it up so that initially the person in the scanner was doing quite well, and it was fairly balanced, this game. It was fairly equalized between the subject and the computer. And then the computer, well, they had two other supposed subjects that were in this computer program. And the subject in the fMRI scanner began to be excluded. So the other supposed subjects were playing the game with each other, but leaving out the subject in the scanner. And so the real person felt excluded, was treated unfairly. And what they found was that the same areas of the brain lit up as if they were actually experiencing physical pain. So that feeling of exclusion and of being treated unfairly made them feel as if they were being physically attacked. So this happens when harsh words are spoken as well. So the areas of the brain that lit up were the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. So these people felt they were actually being physically harmed. So it shows the power of words as well, and the power of fairness, really, because our dogs will most likely respond in a similar way. We've all seen dogs get quite miffed when another dog is getting all the attention. And if this study is anything to go by, then they are actually feeling physical pain. You know, they're feeling really hurt and really upset. But the brain's reward centre, the ventral striatum, reacts just as strongly to social rewards as if they're physical rewards. So basically, there was an article recently about was praise as strong as a treat, and that lots of us read on Facebook. And most of us felt that, in fact, it's better to use a treat as well as praise, because we really want to reinforce the behaviours that we want from our dogs. And this is something that I think, you know, really bombard them with rewards, let them really know that we're very happy with what they've done, so that they want to continue to do that. But in fact, social rewards, company praise, positive feedback light up the brain's reward centre in the same way as if they're physical rewards. And they found when they did this with human subjects that they lit up as strongly to social rewards as they did to monetary rewards. So being treated fairly activates the ventral stratum as well. which is in the prefrontal cortex near the hypothalamus. So what can we do? We can change the emotion to change the behaviour. This is what we've been all saying for quite some time, but there's more to it than that. First of all, before we can change the emotion, we have to change the perception or the appraisal of the event that is the instigator of the emotion. So by changing the perception, this changes the emotion, which subsequently changes the behavioural response. So by being aware of facial expressions and body language and trying to pinpoint what the event is that could be the cause of an emotion, the true cause of an emotion, then we can figure out how to change the perception. Also, it's important to think about whether we're seeing a primary emotion or a secondary emotion, bearing in mind that very often the primary emotion comes and goes in a flash, and the secondary emotion steps in very quickly and is what we tend to see in the longer term. So if you're feeling that possibly you're seeing a secondary emotion, then you can think, what could the primary emotion have been based on what the secondary emotion is? We need to take action to help the dog feel safe and be kind and gentle. Remember that emotional rewards as well as physical rewards light up the ventral striatum. Consider the moods and feelings and their effects as well as the emotions, bearing in mind that the three things are all very different, and monitor our own emotional states and responses so that we're giving the right feedback, we're putting out the kind of energy atmosphere, if you like, that is what we want to be putting out for our dogs, that we want them to pick up on, rather than emotional states that are actually going to be quite disturbing or uncomfortable for our dogs. And there we are. Actually, I must have talked quite fast because we got through that in an hour and it was a bit longer than the last one. So just see if there's, oh, has anybody got any questions? I can't see any questions have come up. Did you find it easy to understand? It's all very quiet. Okay. Well, I hope you could see it all and hear it right through to the end. Oh, there are some questions or feedback. Thank you, Nolwenn, who says, fair bit of scientific words, but easy enough to follow. Thank you. Sparky says, are there any studies on the colour of the dog's face and eyes and their correlation with problems relating to communications? I don't have any personally, Sparky, but there may well be. We do know that with dogs who have very hairy faces or black faces, that other dogs find it harder to understand them because their communication isn't as easily visible. Kathy says, easy to understand, not sure it would be so easy to interpret in a dog. It's surprising, actually. Oh, thank you. Emma says, thought it was fabulous. And Alison says, I think it's very interesting. Fascinating topic. Oh, you're welcome, Emma. Fiona says, thank you, very interesting, easy to follow. And Liz says, thanks for doing this. As again, I enjoyed it. Whoops. Laura says, that was totally worth the wait. It was fascinating. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Laura. Oh, there's lots of really nice positive feedback that you found it helpful. That's really great. I think Lainey had some problems with sound at one point, but she came back because there was a comment there, I think. So as Emma says, you can film your dog and slow-mo it to see all the facial expressions. It's really, really interesting. And Sparky, asked a very good question. She said, you mentioned repression and suppression. Do dogs try to suppress? Hard to tell, isn't it? I don't think so. I mean, it's something, I was having a conversation not long ago about micro expressions with Tony, and we were talking about micro expressions in dogs, and I was saying that I felt that with humans, when they're suppressing an expression, when a micro expression reveals that they're suppressing something, it's because they don't want us to know. Dogs are much more upfront than humans are, so I think it's pretty unlikely when it comes down to it. And it's lovely to see that we've got people here from the UK and Canada and America as well. Thank you for taking out time out on your Sunday afternoon. Our friends over the other side of the ocean. So, okay, great. Maya says, can we have a copy of those slides? I can put the presentation in the file section on the group page. Yeah, obviously they will just be for you to use for reference. Please don't pass them on to anybody else. Lenny says she found it easy to understand, especially with primary, secondary, high and slow burn. Marvellous, thank you. I'm glad that you could hear okay in the end. Sparky says, how can we influence the signatures of extroversion and introversion in dogs? I think that would be very difficult, actually, because this is something that clearly occurs at a very, very early age, and we're all very aware of how the pregnancy and the beginning of life is really important for shaping a dog's personality, just as it is with humans too. But of course we notice it more with dogs because they grow so much faster than human children. So I think really just lots of positive influences as early as possible. And if you have a dog who is extrovert, then obviously you would be creating stimulation that would be appropriate for that dog. Likewise with dogs who are much more introverted, then you can work to bring them out of that a little, you know, give them lots of enjoyment, but allow them to be introverts as well, because obviously you wouldn't put an introverted dog in a room full of people and expect them to be happy about everybody going over to say hello and stroke him and everything, because he'd be very uncomfortable in that situation. But you can work to gradually expand the horizons for introverted dogs so that they get plenty of enjoyment, and give them the space that they need when they need it. It's really important. Just with introverted people, they may really enjoy being around their friends some of the time, but they really need time alone. Katie says, I struggle with human facial expressions, but have learned from dogs more how to read people's faces. That's brilliant, Katie. Yeah, because dogs are so aware of our expressions. You know, they use left gaze bias. They're very aware of our emotions. They watch us very, very closely. So it's great. Oh, Lisa Dickinson, good to see you came too. Thank you. And yeah, emotions are never static. Suki, Emma says, Suki has very strong facial expression to rescue Remedy. So is it disgust? Does she wrinkle her nose? Is it really strong for her? Oh, thank you, Sparkin, and everybody for all the really, really lovely feedback. Whoops. It keeps slipping back because there's quite a lot of comments in there. Yeah, Emma Lee says, I really enjoyed this. I think hounds are easy to read emotions on because you can see their muscles easily. I wonder if this has an impact on their living in groups. Yeah, it must do. I agree about the black groups and hairy dogs. Well, Emma works in a big rescue in France. And she says, I wondered too about the use of the tail in expressing canine emotions, and for those who've had their tails docked, yes, because it's very difficult for other dogs to be able to see what's going on. If you haven't got a tail, then it's very confusing for other dogs. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's been really great to see so many of you here, and I really appreciate it that you took the time to come and join me, and thank you for all the positive feedback too, because this is a subject that I find absolutely fascinating in dogs and in humans, and ultimately everything does come down to emotions. All our behaviours result from our emotions, so it's quite an important subject, really. So thank you very much, and have a good evening or rest of the day if you're overseas. I'll stop recording now. Thank you.